Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's a bright morning, and you're in a place you believe to be one of the safest, most mundane spots imaginable, a barber's chair. The scent of talcum powder and bay rum fills the air. The warm lather is brushed onto your neck, the snipping of scissors is a gentle rhythm, and you're relaxed, vulnerable, your eyes closed. Now, imagine that tranquility shattering in an instant as two masked men burst through the door, their intentions as brutal as they are final. This is not a scene from a movie, this was the very real, very violent end of Albert Anastasia, a man who lived by the gun and, quite predictably, died by it. But the story of how he ended up in that chair, with his eyes closed for the last time, is a dark, sprawling epic of power, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder that shaped the underworld of America. Before we descend into the shadowy world of this criminal mastermind, I must offer a disclaimer. The following narrative is a compilation of facts, historical records, law enforcement reports, and testimonies gathered from various sources. The purpose of this presentation is solely to bring you a comprehensive and accurate account of these events for educational and informational purposes. The views and details presented are a reflection of historical record, not an endorsement of the horrific actions described. Now, if you are ready to step into the brutal and unforgiving life of the man they called the Mad Hatter, settle in, and let us begin this journey from the dusty streets of a small Italian town to the plush, blood-stained carpets of a Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop. Our story begins far from the skyscrapers of New York, in the small, sun-baked town of Tropea, in the Calabria region of Italy. It was here, on September 26, 1902, that Umberto Anastasia was born into a world of poverty and limited prospects. Calabria was a place where life was hard, the land was unforgiving, and the only law that often mattered was the law of family and honor. From a very young age, Umberto was steeped in an environment where strength was respected and weakness was exploited. His father, a hard-working man, died when Umberto was just a boy, leaving his mother to raise a large family in a society that offered little help. This early loss and the struggle for survival forged in him a hardened shell, a resolve that he would not be a victim of his circumstances. He was not a large child, but he possessed a ferocious temper and a willingness to confront anyone, regardless of their size or status, a trait that both alarmed his family and marked him as different. The old world, however, held little promise for a boy with such restless and violent energy. Like millions of other Italians fleeing poverty, the Anastasio family looked across the Atlantic towards the golden promises of America, a land rumored to be paved with opportunity. The journey was a monumental undertaking, a leap of faith into the unknown. After saving and sacrificing, the family secured passage, and a teenage Umberto Anastasio arrived at Ellis Island in 1917, a wide-eyed immigrant stepping onto the hallowed ground of New York Harbor. The reality that greeted him, however, was not the gleaming city of dreams he might have imagined. Instead, he was plunged into the overcrowded, filthy, and fiercely competitive tenement slums of Brooklyn. It was here, in this cauldron of competing ethnicities and desperate ambitions, that the boy Umberto Anastasio began his metamorphosis into the monster who would be known to the world as Albert Anastasia. The streets of Brooklyn were a brutal university, and its curriculum was survival of the fittest. He ran with gangs of other young Italian immigrants, learning the arts of petty theft, intimidation, and street-level extortion. He was a quick and ruthless study. It was during these formative years that he first caught the attention of the local Black Hand organizations, the precursor to the American Mafia. They saw in this volatile young man not just a thug, but a potential weapon. His fearlessness was raw, untempered by caution or remorse. He was willing to do the jobs that others hesitated to take, the kind of work that required a particular coldness of heart. To better assimilate and to perhaps leave his old identity behind, he began using the name Albert Anastasia, a name that would soon inspire terror on the waterfronts of New York and New Jersey. His first major brush with the law came in 1921, a pivotal moment that would set the trajectory for the rest of his life. He and his brother, Tony, were arrested for the murder of a longshoreman named George Torino. It was a standard gangland killing, a dispute over territory or a perceived insult, but for Anastasia, it was a test. The legal system, however, proved to be as malleable as the young thugs who stood before it. Witnesses, crucial to the prosecution's case, developed a sudden and profound case of amnesia. Some simply disappeared. Others were found to be so intimidated that they refused to testify. The case against the Anastasia brothers, which had initially seemed solid, began to crumble under the weight of sheer terror. This was Albert's first, and most important, lesson in the practical application of power. He learned that the law could be defeated not by logic or innocence, but by instilling a fear greater than the fear of the law itself. He was acquitted, walking out of the courtroom a free man, but more importantly, he walked out with a reputation. He was no longer just another hoodlum, he was a man who could beat a murder rap. This reputation was the currency of the underworld, and Albert Anastasia was now, suddenly, a very rich man. This acquittance was his graduation, his passport into the higher echelons of organized crime. He was now a made man in the burgeoning Mafia, a trusted associate of what would become the Mangano family, which controlled the Brooklyn waterfront. The docks were the lifeblood of New York City, a chaotic, sprawling network of piers and warehouses where anything could be stolen, smuggled, or extorted. And it was here, amidst the cacophony of cargo ships and shouting stevedores, that Albert Anastasia would build his empire of fear, one body at a time. With the notoriety of his acquittal solidifying his position, Albert Anastasia was handed the keys to the kingdom of the Brooklyn waterfront. He was appointed as the operating head of the International Longshoremen's Association Local 1814, a title that sounded bureaucratic but in practice was a license to print money through terror. The docks were a perfect ecosystem for corruption. Every piece of cargo that came in or out was vulnerable. Anastasia's system was simple, brutal, and breathtakingly efficient. He controlled the hiring bosses, meaning no one got a job loading or unloading ships without his permission, and a significant portion of their wages was kicked back to him. This was the shape-up system, where men would gather desperately each morning, hoping to be chosen for a day's work, knowing that their selection depended on their loyalty to Anastasia's regime. But the kickbacks from wages were just the beginning. He instituted a multi-layered extortion racket known as the Pad. Shipping companies were forced to pay him to ensure their goods were not stolen or their ships sabotaged. If they refused, their cargo would mysteriously fall into the harbor, or their warehouses would burn down, or their key employees would be brutally beaten. It was a tax on commerce, pure and simple, enforced at the point of a gun or the end of a blackjack. Then there was the outright theft. Anastasia's men would systematically pilfer anything of value from the docks: silk, narcotics, whiskey, electronics. This stolen goods, or swag, was then fenced through a network of warehouses and storefronts, generating millions in illicit revenue. To challenge Anastasia's authority on the docks was a death sentence. Union reformers who tried to clean up the corruption were found beaten to a pulp, or worse, they simply vanished, their bodies weighted down and dumped into the toxic waters of the Gowanus Canal. The police and politicians were largely on the payroll, turning a blind eye to the rampant criminality in exchange for cash or favors. Anastasia ruled his domain with an iron fist, and his temper became the stuff of legend. He was not a strategic thinker like Lucky Luciano or a diplomatic businessman like Meyer Lansky. His management style was pure, unadulterated rage. He would fly into violent tirades over the smallest slight, and his enforcers knew that failure or disloyalty would be met with swift and terminal punishment. It was this mercurial and homicidal nature that earned him the nickname, the Mad Hatter. He was considered volatile, unpredictable, and utterly insane by even the hardened criminals who surrounded him. While he was building his empire on the docks, a much more sinister and organized form of murder was being conceived at the highest levels of the national crime syndicate. Lucky Luciano, the visionary criminal mastermind, saw the need for a more disciplined and businesslike approach to violence. The old ways of bloody gang wars were bad for business, they attracted too much police attention and were unpredictable. The solution was to create a dedicated, centralized arm of the syndicate that could handle contract killings efficiently, cleanly, and, most importantly, deniably. This organization would become known as Murder, Incorporated. And for the role of its chief operating officer, its head executioner, Luciano and his associates needed a man who was not just willing to kill, but who understood murder as a business process. They needed a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was beyond question, a man who could command the obedience of other hardened killers, a man without a shred of sentiment or mercy. There was only one real candidate, Albert Anastasia. He was appointed as the co-founder and operational leader of this murder-for-hire cartel, running it out of a nondescript candy store in Brownsville, Brooklyn, called Midnight Roses. Here, in the back room, the board meetings of death were held. Contracts, or hit slips, were discussed and assigned. The Killers of Murder Incorporated were a mixed crew of Jewish and Italian gangsters, men like Abe, Kid Twist, Reles and Harry, Pittsburgh Phil, Strauss, who became Anastasia's most efficient and prolific instruments. The system was chillingly corporate. A member of the Syndicate from, say, Cleveland or Detroit would have a problem, a rival who needed eliminating, a witness who needed silencing, a partner who had become unreliable. They would bring the contract to the board, and if it was approved, Anastasia would assign a team of out-of-town killers to carry out the hit. This ensured a clean operation with no local connections. The killers would be provided with cars, weapons, and alibis. Under Anastasia's meticulous and ruthless direction, Murder, Incorporated was responsible for an estimated 400 to 700 murders across the United States between 1931 and 1940. He had industrialized homicide, turning it from a crime of passion into a cold, transactional service. He was, by all accounts, the most dangerous and feared man in America, a king who ruled from the shadows, his throne built on a mountain of corpses. The machinery of Murder, Incorporated, ran with a grim, factory-like precision under Albert Anastasia's command, and its operations provide the most chilling insight into his character. He was not a hands-off manager. He was deeply involved in the planning and often the execution of the contracts he approved. The back room of Midnight Roses was his war room, where maps were studied, alibis were fabricated, and murder methods were debated with the cold detachment of engineers solving a logistical problem. Anastasia believed in using the right tool for the job. Ice picks were a favorite. They were quiet, easily disposable, and left a small, neat wound that could be mistaken for a medical emergency if the body was found quickly enough. Garrotes were used for silent, up-close killings. Guns were a last resort, as they were loud and attracted immediate attention, but when they were necessary, Anastasia preferred the .38 caliber pistol for its reliability. He drilled into his men the importance of the double cross, luring a victim to a secluded location under a false pretense, such as a meeting or a party, where they could be dispatched without witnesses. One of the most infamous techniques he pioneered was the double ice pick method, where two assassins would approach the victim from either side on a crowded street and simultaneously plunge ice picks into his body, then melt away into the crowd before the victim even hit the ground, the cause of his collapse a mystery to bystanders. Anastasia's personal involvement was never in doubt. He was suspected of personally participating in the murder of Giuseppe Masuria, the old-world Mafia boss, during the Castellamarese War, a hit orchestrated by Lucky Luciano to seize power. The story goes that Anastasia was one of the gunmen who stormed the restaurant where Masuria was eating and shot him to death, a brazen act that announced the rise of the new, more corporate-style American Mafia. His power and influence seemed unassailable. He lived a life of luxury, moving into a grand house in Fort Lee, New Jersey, a symbol of his success far removed from the tenements of his youth. He was a family man on the surface, a devoted husband and father, a paradox that many ruthless criminals of his era maintained. He donated to local charities, was a pillar of his church, and was known to be generous to his neighbors, all while presiding over a national assassination bureau. This duality was a shield, allowing him to operate in plain sight. For nearly a decade, Murder Incorporated operated with impunity. The police were baffled by the sheer number of seemingly unconnected gangland slayings across the country. They had no concept of a centralized murder authority. The killers were professionals who left no evidence, and the code of omerta, the sacred vow of silence, seemed unbreakable. The entire enterprise was a testament to Anastasia's organizational skills and his ability to instill absolute fear. His men were loyal not out of affection, but out of a terrified understanding that betrayal meant a one-way ticket into the trunk of a car. The system was perfect, a self-policing engine of death. But every empire, no matter how well fortified, has a weakness. For Albert Anastasia and his murderous consortium, that weakness would come in the form of a small, nervous, and talkative man named Abe "Kid Twist" Reles. Reles was one of Anastasia's most trusted and prolific trigger men, a man with direct knowledge of hundreds of murders, including many that Anastasia had personally ordered. In 1940, the seemingly impossible happened. Reles was arrested on a murder charge. Facing the electric chair, and perhaps sensing that his own usefulness to the syndicate was at an end, Reles did the one thing no one thought possible. He broke the code of omerta. He decided to talk. He sat down with an ambitious Brooklyn district attorney named William O'Dwyer and began to sing. For months, he provided a detailed, horrifying map of the entire murder, incorporated operation. He named names, described hits, revealed burial sites, and most dangerously for Albert Anastasia, he directly implicated him as the mastermind. The confessions of Abe Reles were a seismic event in the underworld. They led to multiple indictments and convictions. Harry, Pittsburgh Phil, Strauss and others were sent to the electric chair based largely on Reles' testimony. The net was closing tightly around Anastasia himself. For the first time in his adult life, the Mad Hatter was facing the very real possibility of a date with the executioner. The case against him seemed airtight. They had an insider, a co-conspirator, ready to point the finger directly at him in a court of law. Albert Anastasia's world was crumbling, and his violent demise seemed inevitable, delivered not by a rival's bullet, but by the cold, meticulous process of the law he had evaded for so long. As Albert Anastasia sat in his cell, awaiting what seemed like an inevitable murder trial and a one-way trip to the electric chair, the entire underworld held its breath. The testimony of Abe "Kid Twist" Reles was a ticking time bomb that threatened not just Anastasia, but the entire national crime syndicate. If a man of Reles' stature could flip, then no one was safe. The delicate balance of power, built on a foundation of fear and silence, was on the verge of collapse. Anastasia, ever the fighter, began plotting his legal defense, but he knew that in a courtroom with Reles on the stand, his chances were slim to none. The only solution, the only way to silence the threat, was to ensure that Abe Reles never made it to the witness stand. This, however, was a seemingly impossible task. Reles was being held under the tightest security imaginable. He was kept in a heavily guarded room on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island, with a full squad of police officers assigned to protect him around the clock. He was the most valuable, and most vulnerable, witness in the country. To get to him would require an act of breathtaking audacity, corruption, or both. And then, on the morning of November 12, 1941, the impossible happened. Abe Reles was found dead on the ground outside the hotel, his body tangled in a makeshift rope made of bedsheets that stretched from his window. The official story was that he had attempted to escape by tying together several sheets and lowering himself down, but the sheets had torn, sending him plummeting to his death. It was a story that nobody who knew the players involved believed for a second. Reles was a street-smart killer, not an amateur climber. The circumstances were deeply suspicious. Why would a man who was singing his heart out, who had been granted immunity and was the star witness for the prosecution, suddenly decide to attempt a risky escape? The bedsheet rope was too short to reach the ground by several floors. The police officers assigned to guard him claimed they were asleep at the time. The whole event reeked of a setup. It was widely believed, though never proven in a court of law, that Albert Anastasia had orchestrated the hit from his jail cell, using his vast network of corrupt police contacts to have Reles thrown from that window. The phrase, "the canary who sang but couldn't fly," entered the underworld lexicon, a darkly humorous epitaph for the man whose testimony died with him. With Reles dead, the case against Anastasia evaporated. The primary witness was gone, and without his testimony, the prosecution had nothing. The charges against Anastasia were dropped, and he walked out of jail a free man for the second time in his life, once again beating a murder rap through a combination of intimidation, corruption, and sheer, brutal luck. The death of Abe Reles was the ultimate demonstration of Anastasia's power. He could reach anyone, anywhere, even from behind bars. He emerged from this crisis more powerful and more feared than ever. The other crime families now looked upon him with a mixture of awe and terror. He had not only survived an existential threat, but he had done so by eliminating the threat in the most dramatic way possible. The end of World War II saw a shift in the underworld landscape. The old guard, men like Lucky Luciano, were being deported. Vincent Mangano was the nominal boss of the family Anastasia belonged to, but Anastasia, with his power base on the docks and his fearsome reputation, was the real power. He grew restless playing second fiddle. In 1951, Vincent Mangano mysteriously disappeared, and his brother, Philip, was found murdered in a swamp in Brooklyn. It was an open secret that Albert Anastasia had orchestrated the coup to seize total control of the family, which would henceforth be known as the Anastasia family. He was now a boss, sitting on the prestigious Commission of the Mafia, the ruling council that governed its affairs. He was at the absolute peak of his power. He expanded his criminal enterprises into Cuba, partnering with Meyer Lansky in casino operations, and continued to rake in millions from the waterfront. But the very qualities that had propelled him to the top, his paranoia, his violent temper, his inability to play well with others, would now set in motion the events that would lead him to that barber's chair. His reign was characterized by impulsive, greedy decisions. He began muscling in on the rackets of other families, particularly the Gambino family, then led by a shrewd and patient man named Carlo Gambino. He openly insulted other bosses, considering them weak and old-fashioned. He was, in the eyes of the more sophisticated mafiosi, a loose cannon, a dangerous relic from a more barbaric time whose unchecked violence was once again attracting unwanted police attention. The other bosses on the commission, including Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, began to see him not as an asset, but as a liability. A plot began to form in the shadows, a contract of the highest order. And the man who had built his legacy on murder, incorporated, was about to become its most high-profile target. The brutal murder of Albert Anastasia in the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel sent shockwaves through the underworld and the public alike. For the average citizen, it was a sensational, front-page story that confirmed their darkest suspicions about the organized crime festering in their city. For the underworld, it was a seismic shift, a calculated political assassination that redefined the balance of power. In the immediate aftermath, the official investigation was, as was often the case, hamstrung by the code of silence. The two gunmen, Stephen Armone and Arnold Wittenberg, along with the lookout, Arthur Coco, melted back into the cityscape, protected by the very fear Anastasia had once instilled in others. No one in the barbershop could positively identify the killers, the descriptions were vague, the faces obscured. The case grew cold with remarkable speed, not for a lack of evidence, but for a surplus of intimidation. The message was clear: asking too many questions about this particular murder was a hazardous occupation. Meanwhile, the true architects of the hit, Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese, moved swiftly and silently to consolidate their power. With Anastasia removed, the family he had brutally seized was now up for grabs. Gambino, who had been the underboss and the strategic mind behind the coup, smoothly ascended to the position of boss, his name forever attached to the criminal empire he would build into a legend. Genovese, believing he had eliminated his most powerful rival, consolidated his own control, positioning himself as the most powerful boss in the country, a title he would hold only briefly before his own empire crumbled under the weight of a narcotics conviction. The execution of Albert Anastasia was more than just the killing of a man, it was the end of an era. It marked the decline of the old school, psychotically violent Mustache Pete, and the full ascendancy of the quieter, more corporate, and infinitely more insidious mobster, epitomized by the low-profile, suit-and-tie approach of Carlo Gambino. These new bosses were businessmen who understood the value of staying out of the headlines. They preferred bribery to bullets, corruption to carnage, whenever possible. Anastasia was a relic, a force of nature whose methods belonged to a bygone age of open gang warfare. His death was a necessary evolution for the Mafia, a bloody pruning of a dangerous branch to allow the rest of the tree to grow stronger and more resilient. Yet, the legend of the Mad Hatter refused to die. He became a folk anti-hero, a symbol of a more raw and terrifying form of power. His story has been told and retold in countless books, films, and television shows, often romanticized, his brutality softened into a caricature of the classic gangster. The real man was far more frightening. He was not a charming rogue but a profoundly damaged individual whose only true talent was for orchestrated violence. His life stands as a dark testament to the American immigrant dream, horribly twisted, a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition is completely divorced from morality and conscience. He rose from nothing on a wave of fear and blood, and he was ultimately consumed by that very same tide. The barbershop murder itself has become a piece of American mythology, a perfectly staged, symbolic hit that encapsulated his entire existence, a moment of forced tranquility violently interrupted, a man at his most vulnerable, killed for the sins of his past by the very system of betrayal he helped to create. The chair he died in, the hotel itself, have become landmarks of infamy, permanent reminders of the day the mob decided to clean its own house. And so, the story of Albert Anastasia ends as it began, in a whirlwind of violence. From the dusty roads of Tropea to the bloody tiles of a midtown barbershop, his journey was a straight, unerring line of carnage. He never expressed remorse, never sought redemption, and never deviated from the brutal path he chose as a young boy on the streets of Brooklyn. He was, in the final analysis, a master of his dark craft, the lord of a kingdom of fear, and a permanent, grim fixture in the annals of American crime. His legacy is not one of honor or respect, but a chilling lesson in the absolute, self-destructive nature of untempered power and paranoia. To truly understand the monster that Albert Anastasia became, one must venture beyond the chronology of his crimes and into the twisted labyrinth of his psyche, a place where paranoia was not an illness but a survival instinct, and rage was not an emotion but a tool of the trade. The man who coolly presided over an industrial-scale murder operation was, in his private moments, a cauldron of simmering anxieties and explosive impulses. His infamous temper was not a performance, it was a fundamental part of his neurological wiring, a flaw in the human machinery that made him uniquely suited for his role as the underworld's chief executioner. Those who knew him, or more accurately, those who worked for him, described a Jekyll and Hyde personality. In one moment, he could be jovial, clapping an associate on the back, making grandiose promises, and displaying a rough, paternal charm. In the next, a perceived slight, a wrong word, a missed appointment, a hesitant look, could trigger a metamorphosis so terrifying it froze the blood. His face would darken, his eyes, often described as small and piercing, would glint with a homicidal mania, and his voice would drop to a low, guttural growl that promised violence. This volatility is what cemented his nickname, the Mad Hatter. It wasn't just that he was violent, it was that his violence was unpredictable, irrational, and utterly disproportionate. He once flew into a rage at a restaurant because his steak was overcooked, not merely complaining to the waiter, but overturning tables, smashing plates, and threatening to burn the establishment to the ground with everyone in it. Another legendary story tells of him pistol-whipping one of his own top earners on the docks nearly to death because the man was 5 minutes late for a meeting. The reason for the delay? The man's wife was giving birth. To Anastasia, there was no excuse, no mitigating circumstance. Loyalty and obedience were absolute, and any deviation, for any reason, was a capital offense. This created an environment of absolute terror within his own organization. His underlings were not merely employees, they were hostages to his moods. They knew that a successful career, even a long life, was not guaranteed by competence or profit, but by the daily, unpredictable state of their boss's mind. This paranoia extended far beyond his immediate circle. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, betrayal in every delayed phone call. He changed his routines constantly, never sleeping in the same bed 2 nights in a row, never taking the same route to a meeting twice. He employed a small army of bodyguards, but he trusted none of them completely. He was a man who had built his empire on betrayal, first by betraying the Old World bosses during the Castellamarese War, and then by betraying the Mangano brothers to seize their family. He understood the mechanics of disloyalty intimately because he had practiced them so expertly himself. Therefore, he expected it from everyone around him. This mindset made him a formidable opponent, but it also made him an impossible ally. On the Mafia's commission, his behavior became increasingly erratic and arrogant. He viewed the other bosses, men like Vito Genovese and Tommy Lucchese, not as peers, but as weak, cautious old men who were too afraid to seize the limitless opportunities before them. He openly mocked their caution, their diplomatic approaches to conflict resolution. In one infamous commission meeting, he reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted that the only way to handle a rival was to chop his head off, dismissing the intricate web of negotiations and territorial agreements that kept the peace. This was not just a difference in style, it was a fundamental philosophical schism. The modern Mafia was trying to become a covert, sophisticated corporation, and Albert Anastasia was a Viking warlord, demanding a raid. His ambitions grew recklessly. Not content with his immense profits from the waterfront, he began to cast covetous eyes on the lucrative gambling and rackets controlled by the Gambino family, then under the nominal leadership of the quiet, ineffectual Frank Scalise, but truly run by the cunning underboss, Carlo Gambino. Anastasia started muscling in, authorizing his men to set up competing numbers games and hijack Gambino-linked trucks. He even began discussing a plan to take over the entire Cuban casino operation from his own partner, Meyer Lansky, a move that Lansky, the financial genius of the Syndicate, would never forgive. Each of these power grabs was another brick in the wall that was slowly enclosing him. He was making powerful, patient enemies, and his greatest weakness was that he could not see the threat they posed because he fundamentally misunderstood their nature. He believed that because they did not respond to his provocations with immediate, overt violence, they were weak. He failed to comprehend that their silence was not fear, but strategy. They were not afraid of a fight, they were simply planning one, and they were planning it with a cold, meticulous precision that Albert Anastasia, for all his homicidal genius, could never muster. His psyche, so perfectly tuned for offense, had no defensive capacity. The very paranoia that kept him safe from external threats blinded him to the conspiracy taking root within his own family, within his own inner circle, a conspiracy led by the man he trusted most, his underboss and brother-in-law, Carlo Gambino. The conspiracy to remove Albert Anastasia was not born in a single moment of rage or a solitary meeting, it was a slow, patient poison, distilled over years of perceived slights, strategic blunders, and growing fear. It was a tumor growing in the dark, fed by Anastasia's own reckless behavior and the quiet ambition of those he considered subordinates. At the heart of this conspiracy was Carlo Gambino, a man who was in every way Anastasia's opposite. Where Anastasia was loud, volatile, and physically intimidating, Gambino was quiet, deliberate, and unassuming. He dressed modestly, spoke softly, and preferred to operate from the shadows, his power emanating not from the barrel of a gun but from the intricate web of alliances and debts he meticulously spun. As Anastasia's underboss, Gambino was the perfect second-in-command for a paranoid boss. He was seemingly devoid of ambition, always deferential, and brilliantly efficient at managing the day-to-day operations of the family, which allowed Anastasia to focus on his larger, more violent ambitions. But this was all a carefully constructed facade. Gambino was a grandmaster of the long game, and he watched with growing alarm as Anastasia's instability threatened to bring the full force of the law down upon their entire organization. The constant, high-profile violence was bad for business. The attempted grabs on other families' territories risked sparking a war that would be financially catastrophic for everyone. Gambino understood that the Mafia's future lay in corruption and infiltration, not in open warfare. Anastasia was becoming an existential threat, a dinosaur whose roaring was attracting meteors. Gambino found a willing and powerful ally in Vito Genovese. Genovese, who harbored his own dreams of becoming the boss of bosses, saw Anastasia as the most significant and dangerous obstacle to his ambition. Anastasia's power and his seat on the commission were a check on Genovese's own expansionist plans. Furthermore, there was a deep, personal animosity between the two. Genovese, who had fled to Italy to avoid a murder charge in the 1930s, had returned to America after the war to reclaim his empire, only to find that Anastasia had grown immensely powerful in his absence. There was a rivalry there, a clash of egos between two men who believed they were destined to rule. Genovese was every bit as ruthless as Anastasia, but he was far more cunning and patient. He saw in Gambino's quiet ambition the perfect weapon to use against their common enemy. The alliance was sealed in whispers and secret meetings, away from the prying eyes and ears of Anastasia's vast network of informants. They were joined by Tommy, Three-Finger Brown, Lucchese, another strategic thinker who saw the wisdom in removing the volatile Anastasia from the board. This was the core of the plot, the three most calculating minds in the American Mafia, united against its most volatile force. Their first and most crucial step was to isolate Anastasia, to strip him of his allies and make him vulnerable. They began a subtle but relentless campaign of character assassination within the wider commission. They painted Anastasia as a mad dog, who could not be controlled, whose greed and temper would inevitably lead to a war that would destroy them all. They reminded the other bosses of his unauthorized hits, his public outbursts, his encroachment on established territories. They framed their argument not as a power grab, but as a necessary act of self-preservation for the entire syndicate. This was a masterstroke, as it turned Anastasia's greatest strength, his fearsome reputation, into his greatest liability. The other bosses, who had once been wary of him, now became fearful of what his instability might cost them. With the ideological groundwork laid, Gambino began his work from within the Anastasia family itself. He used his position as underboss to quietly sound out the family's capo regimes, the captains who controlled the crews. He didn't need to openly recruit them, he merely had to plant the seed of doubt. He would speak of Anastasia's recklessness, of how his wars were costing the family money, of how his temper had led to the deaths of loyal soldiers for no good reason. He presented himself not as a traitor, but as the only sane alternative, the man who could ensure the family's prosperity and survival in a post-Anastasia world. Many of the captains, tired of living in constant fear of their own boss's temper and worried about the financial future, were quietly swayed. The most critical conversion was that of Anthony, Tough Tony Anastasio, Albert's own brother, who controlled the waterfront unions. Despite their blood relation, Tony had grown weary of his brother's madness and saw the writing on the wall. His decision to side with Gambino was the final, internal lock on Anastasia's fate. With the commission's tacit approval, the family's captains neutralized, and his own brother's allegiance severed, Albert Anastasia was now a king without a kingdom, a general without an army. He sat in his Fort Lee mansion, surrounded by bodyguards he could no longer trust, utterly unaware that the noose, woven from the very threads of fear and ambition he had spent a lifetime manipulating, was already around his neck. The contract, the highest level hit in the history of the American Mafia, had been officially approved. The only thing left was to choose the time and the place. The final act of Albert Anastasia's life unfolded with a chilling, almost theatrical precision, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that had characterized his reign. The plotters, having secured the necessary approvals and internal betrayals, now moved to the operational phase. The execution had to be flawless. It could not look like a traditional mob hit, which would point directly to a rival family and risk igniting the very war they were trying to avoid. It had to be a public spectacle that simultaneously sent an unmistakable message to the underworld while remaining opaque to the authorities. The choice of location was a stroke of sinister genius. The barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel on West 56th Street was not some secluded, dark alley. It was a public space in a busy, upscale hotel, a place where powerful men conducted business. This very public setting was chosen precisely because it was so audacious. It demonstrated the absolute confidence and reach of the conspirators. They could strike anywhere, at any time, no matter how secure their target felt. The date, October 25, 1957, was also significant, though not for any symbolic reason. It was simply the day the pieces fell into place. Anastasia, ever the creature of habit despite his paranoia, had a routine. He was staying at the hotel, and he often visited the barbershop for a mid-morning trim. The hit team, carefully selected from outside the immediate New York families to maintain deniability, was already in position. The key players were Stephen Armone, a reliable Gambino soldier, and Arnold "Chippy" Wittenberg, with Arthur Coco acting as the lookout. Their instructions were clear and brutal: swift, overwhelming force, no words, no hesitation. On that fateful morning, Anastasia awoke in his suite. His mood was reportedly agitated, the pressures of his self-made crises were mounting. There were whispers later that he had a premonition, a feeling of dread he couldn't shake. But a man like Anastasia lived with dread, it was his constant companion. He went about his morning, and around 10:20 a.m., he descended to the lobby and entered the barbershop. He was a familiar figure there. He nodded to the barbers, took his preferred chair, the second one in from the entrance, and settled in. The shop was busy, with other customers in various stages of haircuts and shaves. The normalcy of the scene was absolute. The barber, Arthur Grasso, draped a cloth over Anastasia, tilted the chair back, and began applying warm lather to his face for a shave. Anastasia, a man who never closed his eyes in the presence of others, finally did. He was in a state of vulnerable relaxation, a rare moment of peace in a life defined by violence. This was the moment the plotters had counted on. At precisely 10:25 a.m., two men, their faces obscured by pulled-up coat collars and fedoras pulled low, entered the shop. They moved with purpose, ignoring the other customers and staff. They walked directly to Anastasia's chair. The lookout, Coco, remained near the entrance, ensuring no one interrupted the grim proceedings. What happened next was a blur of controlled chaos. The two gunmen drew their pistols, .38 caliber revolvers, the tool of their trade. Anastasia, his senses perhaps triggered by a sudden shift in the room's energy or the sound of footsteps too close and too deliberate, opened his eyes. In that split second, he saw his death approaching. The legends say his face registered not fear, but a kind of furious, impotent rage. He had time to let out a guttural shout, a half-formed curse, before the first shots rang out. The gunmen did not fire a wild volley, their shots were measured and deliberate. The first bullet struck him in the back of the head and the right hand, which he had thrown up in a futile, instinctive gesture of defense. The force of the impact threw him forward. He crashed into the large mirror in front of him, shattering the glass. The room erupted in screams. The other customers and barbers dropped to the floor, scrambling for cover. The two assassins stood over the now slumped figure of the most feared man in the underworld and fired several more shots into his back and body at point-blank range, ensuring the job was done. The entire event, from the moment they entered to the moment they turned and walked calmly back out onto 56th Street, took less than 20 seconds. They left behind a scene of carnage and surreal horror. Albert Anastasia lay dead on the barbershop floor, surrounded by shards of mirror, pools of his own blood mingling with the spilled talcum powder and hair tonic, his body positioned almost as if in a final, grotesque parody of the sleep he would never again experience. The police, when they arrived, found a .32 caliber pistol tucked into his waistband, unfired. The man who had ordered hundreds of murders never had a chance to commit one final act of violence in his own defense. The image of his lifeless body, lying beneath that shattered mirror, became one of the most iconic photographs in the history of American crime, a stark and permanent monument to his brutal end and the even more brutal world he had helped to create. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was a study in chaos and the strict, unspoken codes of the underworld. As the two gunmen and their lookout melted into the midday crowds of Midtown Manhattan, a stunned silence briefly gripped the barbershop before being broken by panicked shouts and the frantic calls for the police. The other customers and barbers, now picking themselves up from the floor, were faced with the gruesome spectacle of Albert Anastasia's body lying in a rapidly expanding pool of blood, surrounded by the glittering shards of the mirror he had shattered in his death throes. The scene was so violent, so surreal, that it felt like a grotesque violation of the ordinary world, a nightmare intruding upon the mundane rituals of a morning shave. When the police arrived, they were met with a wall of silence that was as impenetrable as any they had ever encountered. The witnesses, though shaken, had suddenly developed a collective amnesia. Descriptions of the killers were vague, contradictory, and ultimately useless. They were men in hats and coats, was the extent of the detail most could provide. No one had seen their faces clearly, no one could identify them in a lineup. This was not necessarily a result of direct intimidation in those first moments, but rather an ingrained understanding of the rules of the world they had just glimpsed. To speak was to sign your own death warrant, and everyone in that room knew it. The investigation, led by the NYPD's Homicide Division, hit a dead end almost immediately. They knew, of course, who the victim was. The identity of Albert Anastasia alone pointed to a professional, mob-sanctioned hit. The sheer audacity of the location, the clinical efficiency of the execution, and the complete lack of usable witnesses all screamed of a contract carried out with the official blessing of the commission. The police scoured Anastasia's recent activities, looking for a motive. They found a man besieged. His own family was fracturing beneath him, his alliances were crumbling, and he had made powerful, patient enemies in Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese. Yet, proving this in a court of law was an impossibility. The murder weapons were never found. The getaway car was never located. The hit team, Stephen Armone, Arnold Wittenberg, and Arthur Coco, were protected by the powerful Gambino family and were never formally charged with the murder, though law enforcement and the underworld knew their identities. The case grew cold, becoming another infamous, unsolved gangland killing in the files of the NYPD. For the public, the murder was a sensational front-page story, a shocking glimpse into the brazen lawlessness of the American Mafia. For the underworld, it was a seismic event that sent a clear and unambiguous message. The old guard of violent, unpredictable bosses was no longer tolerable. The era of the mad dog was over. The killing was a corporate restructuring, a hostile takeover executed with lethal force. It solidified the power of the new generation of bosses, the quiet, calculating, and business-like Carlo Gambino, who now seamlessly assumed control of the vast criminal empire Anastasia had once ruled. There was no war of succession, no internal power struggle. Gambino had so thoroughly engineered the coup that the transition of power was instantaneous and peaceful, at least within the family. The other families on the commission accepted the new reality without protest. They had, after all, approved it. The message was clear: order had been restored through a single, brutal act of disorder. The barbershop murder became the gold standard for a sanctioned hit, a textbook example of how to eliminate a problem with maximum psychological impact and minimum collateral blowback. In the years that followed, the legend of the hit only grew, embellished in the retelling. Some claimed Anastasia had seen the faces of his killers in the mirror moments before he died, his eyes meeting theirs in a final, silent acknowledgement of his fate. Others whispered that the shattered mirror was a symbol of his shattered power, or perhaps a bad omen that had finally come to pass. The truth was both simpler and more profound. Albert Anastasia was a victim of the very system he helped perfect. He was killed not in a hot-blooded act of revenge, but in a cold, calculated business decision made by men who saw him as a liability. He had lived by the laws of the underworld, and he died by them. His death was not a tragedy, but an inevitability, the logical conclusion of a life spent cultivating power through paranoia and violence, only to have that same paranoia isolate him and that same violence turned against him in the most final way imaginable. The king is dead, long live the king, and in this case, the new king, Carlo Gambino, would build a dynasty that would far outlast and overshadow the terrifying, but ultimately fleeting, reign of the Mad Hatter. The public spectacle of Albert Anastasia's murder did more than just remove a volatile criminal from the board. it ripped aside a carefully maintained curtain, offering the American public and its government a stark, undeniable view of the sophisticated and ruthless organization that had taken root in their midst. For years, J. Edgar Hoover, the powerful director of the FBI, had stubbornly denied the existence of a national crime syndicate, dismissing the idea of a mafia as a myth perpetuated by sensationalist journalists. The Kefauver Committee hearings in the early 1950s had begun to chip away at this official denial, but it was the brazen execution of a top-level boss in a luxury hotel that made the abstraction terrifyingly real. Here was not some back-alley thug, but a man of wealth and apparent standing, cut down in a place of business by a professional hit squad. The newspapers had a field day, but behind the scenes, in the halls of the Justice Department and the FBI, a quiet sense of urgency began to build. The Anastasia murder was a catalyst, a shocking event that galvanized a new generation of federal agents and prosecutors. It became irrefutably clear that local police forces, hampered by jurisdictional limits and pervasive corruption, were woefully unequipped to tackle a criminal enterprise that operated like a multinational corporation with a private army. The message from the underworld had been received, but now a countermessage was being formulated by the forces of law and order. This shift in federal focus would eventually lead to the creation of specialized task forces, the increased use of electronic surveillance, and the passage of new laws like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the very tools that would, decades later, begin to dismantle the empires built by men like Gambino and Genovese. Meanwhile, within the Anastasia family, now seamlessly rebranded as the Gambino family, the transition was a masterclass in corporate restructuring. Carlo Gambino moved with a quiet, ruthless efficiency that was the antithesis of his predecessor's rule. His first order of business was stability. He immediately ceased the aggressive, territorial grabs that had characterized Anastasia's final years. He reached out to the other families, assuring them of his commitment to peace and profitable coexistence. He was a diplomat, not a warlord. He understood that the real power lay not in the fear one could instill in rivals, but in the money one could accumulate and the political protection one could buy. Under his leadership, the family's operations became more sophisticated and less visible. He deepened the family's grip on the garment industry, the private sanitation sector, and the waterfront, but he did so through coercion and corruption of union officials and business leaders, not through public massacres. The brute force was still there, of course, but it was now a tool of last resort, deployed with surgical precision rather than as a weapon of mass terror. Gambino also recognized the immense value in political connections. He cultivated relationships with politicians on every level, from local judges to powerful figures in Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that still held considerable sway in New York City. This network of influence acted as a shield, deflecting investigations and ensuring favorable rulings. The soldiers and captains who had served under Anastasia found the new regime to be both more profitable and far less stressful. The constant fear of their boss's irrational temper was gone, replaced by the predictable, if demanding, expectations of a shrewd CEO. Profits increased, police pressure temporarily decreased, and the family entered a golden age of power and influence that would see it become the most powerful criminal organization in the United States. The contrast between the Anastasia and Gambino eras could not have been more pronounced. One was defined by the roar of gunfire and the shattering of glass in a public barbershop, the other was defined by the quiet scratching of pens on contracts and the silent transfer of funds into offshore accounts. Anastasia's legacy was a body count, Gambino's was a corporate charter. In the end, the conspiracy against Albert Anastasia was not just a successful coup, it was a validation of a new business model for the American Mafia. It proved that in the modern world, the most dangerous man was not the one who shouted the loudest and killed the most freely, but the one who could calculate, manipulate, and consolidate power from the shadows, leaving no fingerprints and making no unnecessary noise. The Mad Hatter was dead, and the age of the Silent Dawn had begun. The reverberations of Albert Anastasia's murder extended far beyond the internal politics of the Gambino family, sending shockwaves through the national criminal syndicate and setting the stage for one of the most significant and tumultuous gatherings in the history of the American Mafia. The hit had been clean, the power transition smooth, but the act of eliminating a sitting boss, a member of the commission, created a power vacuum and a climate of intense suspicion that could not be contained within New York City. Other bosses from across the country, while they had approved the hit, were now keenly aware of the heightened ambitions of Vito Genovese, who saw himself as the clear beneficiary and the new boss of bosses. To address this simmering tension and to discuss the future of their illicit empire in the wake of such a seismic event, a national summit was called. The location chosen was the rural estate of Joseph Barbara in Apalachin, New York, a secluded spot believed to be safe from prying eyes. This gathering, which would take place on November 14, 1957, just 3 weeks after Anastasia's murder, was intended to be a council of war and peace, a chance for the nation's most powerful criminals to solidify new alliances, divide territories, and formally acknowledge the new order. Dozens of mobsters from across the United States and even Italy began converging on the small town, arriving in fleets of expensive cars, all expecting a discreet and productive meeting. Little did they know that the death of Albert Anastasia had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to their greatest collective exposure. A sharp-eyed New York State trooper, Sergeant Edgar Croswell, had been suspicious of Joseph Barbara's activities for some time. Noting the influx of luxury vehicles with out-of-state plates gathering at the remote estate, he set up a roadblock and decided to investigate. What followed was a scene of pure chaos, a comical yet devastating blow to the myth of Mafia invincibility. As police moved in, well-dressed mafiosi, some of the most feared men in America, scrambled into the woods, abandoning their cars and throwing wads of cash into the bushes in a panicked attempt to avoid identification and arrest. Over 60 men were detained and identified that day, including Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, and a who's who of the underworld. The Apalachin summit, intended to be a secret coronation for Genovese, instead became a very public humiliation. The event made headlines across the country, providing irrefutable, tangible proof of a nationwide criminal conspiracy. It was the final nail in the coffin for J. Edgar Hoover's long-standing denial of the Mafia's existence. The FBI was now forced to act, launching an all-out war on organized crime that would define the next 3 decades. The fallout was immediate and severe. Grand juries were convened, and many of the attendees, including Gambino and Genovese, were charged with obstruction of justice and contempt of court for their refusal to explain the purpose of their meeting. While these charges were often minor, the exposure was catastrophic. The mob was no longer a shadowy rumor, it had faces, names, and addresses. The Apalachin debacle shattered the confidence of the commission and created deep, lasting rifts. Vito Genovese, who had orchestrated the meeting to cement his power, was widely blamed for the fiasco. His prestige plummeted, and his enemies, most notably Gambino and Lansky, saw an opportunity. They began to quietly undermine him, setting the stage for his eventual downfall on trumped-up narcotics charges just a few years later. In a profound and ironic twist, the murder of Albert Anastasia, a man who represented the old, brutal ways, directly led to the event that would ultimately doom the modern, corporate mafia he had been killed for threatening. His death was the pebble that started the avalanche. The new era of quiet, business-like mobsters that Carlo Gambino represented was born from Anastasia's corpse, but it was an era that would now be forced to operate under the relentless glare of federal scrutiny. The barbershop hit had solved one problem for the Syndicate but had created an infinitely larger one. The walls, for the first time, were truly beginning to close in. The age of secrecy was over, and the age of prosecution was about to begin, all because the bosses had to meet to discuss the consequences of silencing the Mad Hatter. In the years following his violent death, the legend of Albert Anastasia began to ossify, transforming the man into a myth, a symbol of a bygone era of untamed gangsterism. The historical record, pieced together from court transcripts, police files, and the reluctant testimonies of those who outlived him, paints a picture of a profoundly destructive force, a man whose primary legacy was a river of blood and a mountain of fear. Yet, within the underworld and in the popular imagination, a certain dark romance began to attach itself to his memory. To younger mobsters coming of age in the more bureaucratic, less flamboyant Gambino era, Anastasia represented a pure, unadulterated form of power. He was not a negotiator or a corporate raider in a suit. He was a predator, a force of nature who took what he wanted through sheer, terrifying will. This romanticized version, however, is a dangerous distortion. The real Albert Anastasia was not a principled man of honor adhering to a strict code. He was a psychopath who found a society that rewarded his particular pathology. His loyalty was a transactional fiction, his word was worthless, and his violence was often impulsive and self-defeating. He betrayed his old-world bosses to side with Luciano, he betrayed the Mangano brothers to seize their family, and his entire business model was predicated on the betrayal of the public trust through systemic extortion and theft. The core of his power, murder, incorporated, was the ultimate betrayal of community, turning homicide into a detached, assembly line process. To paint him as a noble savage is to fundamentally misunderstand the banality and avarice that drove him. His psychological profile, as deduced from his actions, suggests a man plagued by deep-seated insecurities and a bottomless well of rage, likely born from the traumas of poverty, immigration, and his father's early death. He compensated for these insecurities by cultivating an image of invincibility, but this very image became a cage. He could never show weakness, never retreat, never compromise, because his entire identity was built upon the perception of absolute strength. This psychological inflexibility is what made his downfall inevitable. In a world adapting to new realities, he remained a rigid, unchanging monument to a single, brutal principle. His impact on the structure of organized crime, however, is undeniable. While his managerial style was rejected, the organization he helped build, Murder Incorporated, proved the efficacy of centralized, syndicate-approved violence. It became the model for how the Mafia would handle its internal and external conflicts for decades to come. The concept of a contract handled by dispassionate, out-of-town shooters became standard operating procedure. In this sense, Anastasia was a visionary, albeit a horrifying one. He helped industrialize murder, and while he was ultimately a victim of his own system, the system itself endured long after he was gone. His life also serves as a grim lesson in the self-cannibalizing nature of absolute power. He spent his entire life building a fortress of fear, only to discover that the walls were manned by those who feared him more than they feared any external enemy. His paranoia, once his greatest asset, became the lens through which his subordinates viewed their own survival, and that lens ultimately focused their collective fear into a deadly conspiracy against him. He was a king who ruled by terror, and he died when his subjects realized that the only way to end their terror was to kill the king. There is a profound irony in the fact that the man who perfected the art of the public, demonstrative hit became the victim of the most public and demonstrative hit of his era. The barbershop murder was a masterpiece of the form, a perfect circle of violence that closed the loop on his life. He was killed not by a rival, but by his own reflection, by the monstrous image he had so carefully constructed and which the new generation of mobsters found too dangerous to sustain. The shattered mirror at the Park Sheraton was thus the perfect metaphor for his existence, a reflection of power, violently broken, leaving behind only sharp, dangerous fragments and a distorted image of what once was. The story of Albert Anastasia is inextricably woven into the very fabric of 20th century New York, a dark thread running through the bustling tapestry of the city's growth and modernization. To understand his rise is to understand the specific conditions that allowed a creature like him to flourish. The New York waterfront of the 1920s through the 1950s was a world unto itself, a chaotic, vibrant, and brutally competitive ecosystem where the sheer volume of commerce created unparalleled opportunities for corruption. It was a place where the rules of civilized society were suspended, replaced by the raw law of the jungle, and Anastasia was its perfect apex predator. The docks were the city's economic lungs, breathing in and out the goods that fueled the American dream, and Anastasia positioned himself as a parasite on that vital organ, siphoning off its lifeblood for his own enrichment. His control over the International Longshoremen's Association was not just about stealing from the paychecks of hard-working men, it was about controlling the flow of everything in and out of the city. This gave him a stranglehold on the entire regional economy, a level of power that few politicians or legitimate business leaders could ever hope to wield. He was a shadow governor of the port, his authority enforced not by legislation or public mandate, but by the cracked skulls of anyone who challenged him. His reign coincided with the peak of urban political machine corruption, where Tammany Hall and its counterparts were more interested in backroom deals and kickbacks than in civic virtue. This created a perfect environment for Anastasia to operate with impunity. Police were bought, judges were influenced, and politicians looked the other way, all greased by the steady flow of cash from the waterfront rackets. He was a product of this specific time and place, a symptom of a city growing faster than its institutions could control. Yet, his influence extended beyond the grimy piers and warehouses. The vast profits he generated from the docks helped fund the national ambitions of the Luciano crime family and, later, fueled the expansion of the Gambino empire. He was a vital financial artery for the Syndicate, a generator of capital that allowed the Mafia to diversify into legitimate businesses and other illicit ventures like narcotics and gambling. His violent enforcement arm, Murder, Incorporated, provided a crucial service that stabilized the entire national criminal structure by providing a deniable, efficient means of conflict resolution. Without Anastasia's ruthless efficiency, the peace brokered by Lucky Luciano after the Castellamarese War might have collapsed back into the chaotic gang warfare of the Prohibition era. In this sense, he was a foundational pillar of the modern American Mafia, a key architect of the corporate-style syndicate that would dominate organized crime for the next half-century. His death, therefore, was not just the removal of a man, but the toppling of a pillar, an event that necessitated a fundamental restructuring of the entire criminal edifice. The Appalachian meeting was a direct consequence of this structural shock, an attempt by the other bosses to steady the foundation after removing one of its most volatile supports. And the subsequent government crackdown was the legitimate world's reaction to finally seeing the true scale and structure of the organization Anastasia had helped build. His life and death, therefore, act as a crucial hinge in the history of organized crime, marking the end of its formative, openly violent period and the beginning of its mature, though ultimately doomed, era of corporate mimicry and political corruption. He is a figure who cannot be understood in isolation. He is a reflection of the city that created him, a dark embodiment of its ambition, its violence, its corruption, and its relentless, immoral drive for power and profit. The same forces that built the skyscrapers and the great bridges also built Albert Anastasia, and his story is a permanent, bloody stain on the pages of New York's grand history. The personal life of Albert Anastasia presents a jarring paradox, a study in stark contrasts that was common among many of his contemporaries in the underworld. Publicly, he was the Mad Hatter, the Lord of the Docks, the Master of Murder, Incorporated, a man whose name was spoken in whispers, synonymous with brutality and sudden death. Privately, however, he cultivated the image of a devoted family man and a pillar of his community. He married Elsa Ward in 1933, and together they raised 2 children, a son and a daughter, in a lavish home in Fort Lee, New Jersey, a world away from the blood-soaked streets of Brooklyn. In this suburban enclave, he was not Albert Anastasia, the killer. He was a husband and a father, a generous neighbor, a regular churchgoer who made substantial donations to the local parish. He was known to dote on his children, providing them with every material comfort and a life of privilege he could never have dreamed of as a boy in Tropea. This duality was a conscious and calculated act. The respectable home life was a shield, a form of camouflage that allowed him to operate in plain sight. It provided a veneer of normality that confused law enforcement and disarmed suspicion. How could this affable family man, this generous donor to charity, be the same person who ordered the cold-blooded execution of hundreds? This schism between the private and the public self is one of the most chilling aspects of his character. It suggests a compartmentalization so complete that he could preside over a meeting planning multiple murders and then return home to help his children with their homework or attend a neighborhood barbecue. There was no apparent guilt, no moral conflict. The 2 worlds coexisted within him, separated by an impenetrable wall. This ability to segregate his humanity from his monstrous actions is perhaps the truest indicator of his psychopathy. He did not see his victims as human beings with families and lives, they were simply problems to be eliminated, obstacles to be removed. His family was his sanctuary, but it was also his most effective alibi. This double life, however, came with its own unique pressures and perils. The constant threat of violence, the ever-present fear of retaliation or arrest, cast a long shadow over the domestic idol he tried to create. His children grew up in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but also by bodyguards and the unspoken knowledge of their father's true profession. The need for security dictated their lives. Their home was a fortress, their movements were monitored, and their father's paranoia seeped into every aspect of their existence. He could never truly relax, never let his guard down, even in his own home. The man who demanded absolute control over the waterfront could not control the fear that his own actions had generated. The very violence that empowered him also imprisoned him and his family. This internal tension, the constant strain of maintaining the facade, likely contributed to his famous temper. The rage that he unleashed on the docks and in the back rooms of Midnight Roses may have been, in part, a release of the immense psychological pressure created by his double life. The calm, controlled family man was a performance, and the real Albert Anastasia was the seething, violent entity that simmered just beneath the surface, always ready to erupt. In the end, his attempt to build a normal life was a futile endeavor. The world he had created for himself was always destined to invade and destroy the world he had built for his family. The violence followed him home, not in the form of a rival's bullet, but in the corrosive anxiety that tainted his every moment of peace. And when the final confrontation came, it did not happen in a dark alley, but in a public space that mirrored the divided nature of his life, a place of mundane routine and personal care, violently transformed into a slaughterhouse. The two worlds collided with a thunderous finality in that barbershop, and the private man, the father and husband, was obliterated forever, leaving behind only the public legend of the monster, a legend that would forever overshadow the complicated, contradictory, and ultimately tragic figure he cut in the quiet moments of his life. The operational mechanics of murder, incorporated, under Albert Anastasia's stewardship, represented a chilling evolution in the business of crime, a shift from artisanal violence to industrialized slaughter. To view it as a mere gang of killers is to underestimate its profound bureaucratic innovation. It was, in essence, a public utility for homicide, a centralized service bureau that offered clean, deniable, and efficient elimination for a clientele comprised of the most powerful criminals in America. The process was streamlined with a corporate efficiency that would be the envy of any legitimate enterprise. A client, say a Midwestern boss facing a recalcitrant associate or a New York family with a territorial dispute, would bring a proposal for a murder to the board, which operated out of the back of Midnight Rose's candy store. The proposal would be debated on its merits. Was the target a genuine threat to Syndicate stability? Was the hit likely to cause excessive police heat or a disruptive gang war? If the contract was approved, Anastasia, as Chief Operations Officer, would assign a team. The selection of assassins was a masterstroke of operational security. He preferred to use killers who were not from the same city or even the same criminal family as the target. This minimized the chance of recognition and ensured that if the killers were caught, they could reveal no local connections that might lead back to the client. These teams, men like Abe Reles and Harry Strauss, were provided with all the necessary tools, untraceable cars, clean weapons, and most importantly, rock-solid alibis. They would be transported to the city, execute the contract with clinical precision, and then be immediately extracted, often before the body was even discovered. The methods themselves were refined for maximum effect and minimum noise. The ice pick, as previously mentioned, was a favorite for its silence and the ambiguity of the wound. Garroting was another preferred method, a terrifyingly intimate form of murder that left no ballistic evidence. When guns were necessary, they are used with overwhelming force at point-blank range to ensure the job was done, and the weapons were then immediately dismantled and discarded in separate locations, the barrel in one river, the frame in another, the grips burned. Anastasia instilled in his men a strict code of professional conduct. There was to be no unnecessary cruelty, no sadistic prolonging of the victim's suffering. Murder was a transaction, not a passion. Emotion was a liability. The goal was a swift, clean termination that looked, as much as possible, like a random street crime or an accident. This professional detachment was what made the organization so terrifyingly effective. It removed the human element from homicide. The killers did not know their victims, bore them no personal grudge, and felt no remorse. They were simply technicians performing a specialized task. The financial structure was equally sophisticated. Payment for the service was not a direct cash transaction between the client and the hitmen. It was filtered through the syndicate's financial apparatus, often disguised as a business loss or a gambling debt, making it virtually untraceable. The killers themselves were on a salary, drawing a regular weekly income from the syndicate's coffers, with bonuses for particularly dangerous or high-profile jobs. This regular payroll fostered loyalty and ensured that the organization's most valuable assets, its trained assassins, remained content and available. Anastasia's genius lay in his understanding of scale and process. He did not invent contract killing, but he perfected it, systematizing it and scaling it up to a national level. He was the Henry Ford of homicide, taking a craft and turning it into an assembly line. For nearly a decade, this macabre corporation operated with breathtaking impunity, its body count rising into the hundreds, its existence unknown to law enforcement. It was the ultimate instrument of power for the Commission, a way to enforce its will across the country without getting its hands dirty. The existence of Murder Incorporated was the darkest secret of the American Mafia, and Albert Anastasia was its Dark Lord, a man who had found his true calling in the administration of death, a CEO whose product was corpses and whose market share was absolute. The unraveling of this meticulously constructed empire of death began not with a dramatic shootout or a high-level defection, but with a seemingly minor and unrelated arrest in the summer of 1940. A small-time hoodlum and strong-arm enforcer named Abe "Kid Twist" Reles was picked up by Brooklyn police on a murder charge. Reles was a known quantity, a prolific killer for the syndicate, but he was considered a reliable, if particularly vicious, cog in the machine. Initially, he adhered to the sacred code of omerta, saying nothing to the authorities. He understood the rules: you did not talk, you took your punishment, and the organization would take care of your family. But as he sat in his cell, facing the very real prospect of the electric chair, a cold calculus began to form in his mind. He knew too much, and in the world of organized crime, knowing too much made you a liability, not an asset. He had seen how the syndicate treated liabilities. The promise of care for his family began to feel hollow when weighed against the certainty of his own execution. Furthermore, the particular charge he was facing was not a sanctioned syndicate hit, it was a personal, messy killing, which meant he could not rely on the full weight of the organization to come to his defense. He felt isolated and expendable. It was this potent cocktail of fear, self-preservation, and a perceived betrayal that led Abe Reles to make the most consequential decision of his life: he would break the vow of silence. He sent word to the Brooklyn District Attorney, William O'Dwyer, that he was ready to talk, and he wanted a deal. What followed was a torrent of confessions that stunned even the most jaded investigators. For months, Reles spoke, providing a detailed, unvarnished, and comprehensive map of Murder Incorporated. He named names, described in graphic detail dozens of murders, revealed burial sites, and explained the entire corporate structure of the Assassination Bureau. He was not just a participant, he was a historian of horror, his memory a perfect archive of every killing, every planning session, every getaway. His testimony was a guided tour through the abyss, and at the center of that abyss, he consistently placed Albert Anastasia. He detailed Anastasia's role as the operational leader, the man who approved contracts, assigned killers, and often participated in the murders himself. He provided specific, damning evidence linking Anastasia to multiple homicides, evidence that went far beyond hearsay and into the realm of eyewitness testimony from a co-conspirator. The impact of Reles singing was immediate and catastrophic for the syndicate. Indictments began to rain down. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, another of the organization's top killers, was convicted and sent to the electric chair based largely on Reles' testimony. Other gunmen and associates were rounded up and imprisoned. But the ultimate prize for O'Dwyer was Albert Anastasia himself. With Reles' testimony, they had what they believed was an airtight case. Anastasia was arrested and charged with murder. For the first time, the Mad Hatter was truly cornered. The man who had evaded justice for his entire adult life, who had beaten a murder rap in 1921 through intimidation, now found himself facing a witness who could not be intimidated, a man who was under 24-hour armed guard and was prepared to point a finger directly at him in a court of law. The Syndicate was thrown into a panic. The entire delicate structure built by Luciano and maintained by Anastasia was on the verge of collapse. If Anastasia was convicted and executed, it would be a devastating blow, but if he, in turn, decided to follow Reles' example and start talking to save his own skin, he could bring down the entire commission. The situation was existential. Anastasia, from his jail cell, knew that his only hope lay in the very methods that had built his empire, violence and intimidation. The order went out, Abe Reles had to be silenced. Permanently. The problem was that he was the most protected man in America, a canary in a gilded, heavily guarded cage on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel. The events that followed would become the stuff of underworld legend, a testament to the Syndicate's far-reaching power and a permanent stain on the New York Police Department. The stage was set for the most infamous, and convenient, fall from a window in the history of American crime. The unraveling of this meticulously constructed empire of death began not with a dramatic shootout or a high-level defection, but with a seemingly minor and unrelated arrest in the summer of 1940. A small-time hoodlum and strong-arm enforcer named Abe "Kid Twist" Reles was picked up by Brooklyn police on a murder charge. Reles was a known quantity, a prolific killer for the Syndicate, but he was considered a reliable, if particularly vicious, cog in the machine. Initially, he adhered to the sacred code of Omerta, saying nothing to the authorities. He understood the rules: you did not talk, you took your punishment, and the organization would take care of your family. But as he sat in his cell, facing the very real prospect of the electric chair, a cold calculus began to form in his mind. He knew too much, and in the world of organized crime, knowing too much made you a liability, not an asset. He had seen how the Syndicate treated liabilities. The promise of care for his family began to feel hollow when weighed against the certainty of his own execution. Furthermore, the particular charge he was facing was not a sanctioned Syndicate hit, it was a personal, messy killing, which meant he could not rely on the full weight of the organization to come to his defense. He felt isolated and expendable. It was this potent cocktail of fear, self-preservation, and a perceived betrayal that led Abe Reles to make the most consequential decision of his life: he would break the vow of silence. He sent word to the Brooklyn District Attorney, William O'Dwyer, that he was ready to talk, and he wanted a deal. What followed was a torrent of confessions that stunned even the most jaded investigators. For months, Reles spoke, providing a detailed, unvarnished, and comprehensive map of Murder, Incorporated. He named names, described in graphic detail dozens of murders, revealed burial sites, and explained the entire corporate structure of the Assassination Bureau. He was not just a participant, he was a historian of horror, his memory a perfect archive of every killing, every planning session, every getaway. His testimony was a guided tour through the abyss, and at the center of that abyss, he consistently placed Albert Anastasia. He detailed Anastasia's role as the operational leader, the man who approved contracts, assigned killers, and often participated in the murders himself. He provided specific, damning evidence linking Anastasia to multiple homicides, evidence that went far beyond hearsay and into the realm of eyewitness testimony from a co-conspirator. The impact of Reles singing was immediate and catastrophic for the Syndicate. Indictments began to rain down. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, another of the organization's top killers, was convicted and sent to the electric chair based largely on Reles' testimony. Other gunmen and associates were rounded up and imprisoned. But the ultimate prize for O'Dwyer was Albert Anastasia himself. With Reles' testimony, they had what they believed was an airtight case. Anastasia was arrested and charged with murder. For the first time, the Mad Hatter was truly cornered. The man who had evaded justice for his entire adult life, who had beaten a murder rap in 1921 through intimidation, now found himself facing a witness who could not be intimidated, a man who was under 24-hour armed guard and was prepared to point a finger directly at him in a court of law. The Syndicate was thrown into a panic. The entire delicate structure built by Luciano and maintained by Anastasia was on the verge of collapse. If Anastasia was convicted and executed, it would be a devastating blow, but if he, in turn, decided to follow Reles' example and start talking to save his own skin, he could bring down the entire commission. The situation was existential. Anastasia, from his jail cell, knew that his only hope lay in the very methods that had built his empire, violence and intimidation. The order went out, Abe Reles had to be silenced. Permanently. The problem was that he was the most protected man in America, a canary in a gilded, heavily guarded cage on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel. The events that followed would become the stuff of underworld legend, a testament to the Syndicate's far-reaching power and a permanent stain on the New York Police Department. The stage was set for the most infamous, and convenient, fall from a window in the history of American crime. The circumstances surrounding the death of Abe "Kid Twist" Reles on November 12, 1941, remain one of the most enduring and suspicious mysteries in the annals of American crime, an event that effectively saved Albert Anastasia's life and exposed a web of corruption that likely reached into the highest levels of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and the Police Department. Reles was being held in a supposedly secure room on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island, guarded around the clock by a detail of 6 police officers. He was the star witness, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against the entire Murder, Incorporated, operation. The official report stated that in the early hours of the morning, Reles, in a baffling attempt to escape, tied together several bed sheets to form a rope, fastened one end to a radiator, and attempted to climb down to the street below. The makeshift rope, however, was too short, and he fell the remaining distance to the ground, landing on a hotel extension and then falling to the pavement, sustaining fatal injuries. The story was met with immediate and universal skepticism. The notion that a man who had been granted immunity and was the center of a historic prosecution would suddenly attempt a risky and amateurish escape was ludicrous on its face. Reles was a street-smart killer, not a naive fool. He knew that his value, and therefore his safety, was entirely tied to his continued cooperation with the authorities. To attempt an escape made no sense. The details were even more suspect. The bedsheet rope was reportedly too short by several floors, making the attempt suicidal from the start. The police officers assigned to guard him all claimed to have been asleep at the time of his fall, a collective dereliction of duty that seemed too convenient to be believable. The most plausible theory, one held by nearly every law enforcement official and historian who has studied the case, is that Reles was murdered by his police guards, who were almost certainly on the payroll of the mob. The method was likely simple. He was either thrown from the window or, more probably, was killed inside the room and his body was then dropped to create the illusion of a failed escape. This was the ultimate demonstration of the Syndicate's power. They had reached the most protected witness in the country and had him eliminated while he was in the direct custody of the police. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the prosecution. With Reles dead, his testimony became inadmissible hearsay. The case against Albert Anastasia, which had seemed so certain, evaporated overnight. The charges were dropped, and Anastasia walked out of jail a free man, for the second time cheating the electric chair. The death of Abe Reles earned him the morbid nickname, the Canary who could sing but couldn't fly, and it cemented Anastasia's reputation as a man who was truly untouchable, a Houdini of the justice system who could escape from any trap. For District Attorney William O'Dwyer, who would later become mayor of New York, the incident raised persistent and damaging questions about his own ties to the mob and whether he had allowed, or even facilitated, the hit to happen. The shadow of corruption was long and dark. For the underworld, the message was clear, the Syndicate's reach was absolute, and no one was beyond its grasp. For Anastasia personally, it was a resurrection. He emerged from this brush with death not as a humbled man, but as one emboldened, his power and prestige magnified to almost mythical proportions. He had faced the ultimate threat, the testimony of a trusted insider, and he had not only survived but had triumphed in the most dramatic way possible. This victory, however, would plant the seeds of his eventual destruction. It fed his arrogance, convincing him of his own invincibility. It made him believe that he could operate with impunity, that the rules which applied to other men did not apply to him. The same reckless ambition that had driven him to the top, now unchecked by any fear of legal consequences, would soon drive him to make the fatal errors of judgment that would turn his allies into enemies and set him on a direct collision course with the very men who had helped engineer his miraculous escape from justice. The death of Abe Reles was not an end, but a beginning, the beginning of the final, and most reckless, chapter in the life of the Mad Hatter. Emboldened by his dramatic escape from the law and now operating with a sense of untouchable invincibility, Albert Anastasia entered the final phase of his criminal career, a period marked by increasingly grandiose ambitions and a reckless disregard for the delicate balance of power within the commission. His near execution seemed to have stripped away any last vestiges of caution, unleashing the raw, unmediated ID of the man. He was no longer content with being the master of the docks and the shadowy head of a murder consortium. He began to envision himself as the undisputed ruler of the entire American underworld, a true boss of bosses. This manifested in a series of aggressive and ill-advised power grabs that systematically alienated the very allies who had once supported him. He set his sights on the lucrative and stable criminal enterprises controlled by other families, particularly those of Vito Genovese and the rising Carlo Gambino. He authorized his men to muscle in on their gambling operations, their loan-sharking territories, and their labor rackets. This was a direct violation of the Syndicate's foundational principles, which were built on mutual respect for territorial boundaries. Where a more diplomatic boss would have negotiated a partnership or a percentage, Anastasia simply took, believing that his fearsome reputation would prevent any meaningful retaliation. His behavior on the commission became increasingly intolerable. He openly mocked his fellow bosses, dismissing Genovese as a coward and Gambino as a mere clerk, unworthy of the power he held. He argued for a return to the old days of open warfare, believing that the Syndicate's strength was being diluted by too much talk and not enough action. He saw their caution as weakness, failing to understand that it was, in fact, a sophisticated strategy for long-term survival. This philosophical divide became a chasm. The other bosses saw Anastasia not as a strong leader, but as a destabilizing force, a runaway train that threatened to derail the entire enterprise. His actions were attracting precisely the kind of high-profile police attention that the modern Mafia was trying to avoid. Furthermore, his personal conduct became even more volatile. Stories of his public rages multiplied. He was said to have physically assaulted a waiter at a popular restaurant for a minor mistake, causing a scene that made headlines. He allegedly threatened a city official in the middle of a crowded club. Each outburst was another piece of evidence used by Gambino and Genovese to convince the other commission members that Anastasia was a mad dog who needed to be put down for the good of everyone. The final straw, however, was his ambition regarding Cuba. The island was a golden goose for the mob, a wide-open paradise for gambling, narcotics, and prostitution, largely overseen by Meyer Lansky. Anastasia, greedy for a larger share of the profits, began discussing plans to forcibly take over the Havana operations, even suggesting the possibility of having Lansky killed. This was a fatal miscalculation. Meyer Lansky was not a mafioso in the traditional sense, but he was the financial genius of the Syndicate, a man with immense influence who was respected and protected by every major boss. To threaten Lansky was to threaten the financial stability of the entire national crime syndicate. It was the one move that could unite all of Anastasia's enemies against him with a single purpose. Carlo Gambino, who had been patiently waiting in the wings, now saw his opportunity. He used Anastasia's reckless threats against Lansky and his constant territorial encroachments as the primary justification for the hit. He argued persuasively to the commission that Anastasia was no longer just a problem, he was an existential threat. His greed and insanity would inevitably lead to a war that would destroy them all. The vote was unanimous. The contract on Albert Anastasia was officially approved. The man who had built his legend on the approval of murder contracts was now the subject of the highest-level contract ever issued. The irony was likely lost on him as he continued his blustering, bullying ways, utterly unaware that the trap, baited with his own arrogance, was about to spring shut. He had survived the law, but he would not survive the judgment of his peers. The king had declared himself a god, and his subjects had decided it was time for a sacrifice. The execution of the contract on Albert Anastasia was a masterpiece of cold, clinical planning, a testament to the fact that his enemies had learned every lesson he had ever taught about the art of the hit. The plot, orchestrated by Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese, was a model of operational security and misdirection. The first and most critical step was the complete isolation of the target. Through a campaign of subtle whispers and calculated insubordination, Gambino, as underboss, had already ensured that Anastasia was cut off from the true pulse of his own family. The captains, fearing his temper and swayed by Gambino's promises of a more prosperous and stable future, had effectively switched their allegiance. Anastasia's own brother, Tony, who controlled the vital waterfront unions, had been persuaded to stand aside. This meant that when the strike came, Anastasia would have no one to call for help, no loyal soldiers to rally to his defense. He was a general who had already lost his army, but was still living under the illusion of command. The next step was to choose a time and place that offered both maximum shock value and a guaranteed element of surprise. The barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel was selected precisely because it was so public and so routine. It was a place where Anastasia felt secure, a part of his established pattern. The plotters knew that a man's guard is lowest when he is engaged in the most mundane activities. The hit team itself was carefully chosen to ensure deniability. The two primary shooters, Stephen Armone and Arnold Wittenberg, were reliable Gambino family soldiers, but not high-profile figures directly linked to the inner circle. The lookout, Arthur Coco, was another trusted operative. Using men from within the Gambino organization was a risk, but a calculated one, as their loyalty to Gambino was absolute and the payoff, the removal of Anastasia and Gambino's ascent to power, was their own reward. The team was briefed extensively. They knew Anastasia's routine, his description, and his preferred chair in the barbershop. The plan was simple: enter quickly, execute the target with overwhelming and definitive force, and exit immediately, disappearing into the city's crowds. There were to be no warnings, no speeches, no chance for Anastasia to react. The operation was to be a swift, surgical strike. On the morning of October 25, 1957, the team took their positions. The scene they encountered was perfect. The barbershop was busy enough to provide a backdrop of normalcy, but not so crowded as to impede their escape. Anastasia arrived just as expected, taking the second chair from the entrance. He exchanged pleasantries with the barber, Arthur Grasso, and settled in. As the warm lather was applied to his face and the chair was tilted back, he closed his eyes. This was the moment. His paranoia, the very trait that had kept him alive for so long, had been neutralized by routine and a false sense of security. At 10:25 a.m., the two gunmen, their faces obscured by pulled-up coat collars and the brims of their hats, walked purposefully into the shop. They bypassed the other customers and barbers, moving directly to their target. The sound of their footsteps, their focused intent, must have triggered some primal alarm in Anastasia. His eyes snapped open. In that final, fleeting second of consciousness, he saw the muzzles of the revolvers. He had just enough time to begin a guttural shout, a surge of movement, before the first bullet struck him. The initial shots hit him in the back of the head and his right hand, which he had thrown up in a futile, instinctive block. The impact threw him forward, his body smashing into the large mirror in front of him, shattering the glass. The sound of the gunfire and the breaking mirror triggered panic in the shop. People screamed and dropped to the floor. The assassins, showing a chilling professionalism, stood over his now slumped body and fired several more shots into his back and torso, ensuring the job was complete. The entire event, from entry to exit, lasted less than 20 seconds. The gunman turned and walked calmly out of the barbershop, meeting up with their lookout and vanishing into the streets of Midtown Manhattan. They left behind a scene of surreal horror. The once powerful Albert Anastasia lay dead on the floor, surrounded by shards of his own reflection, his blood seeping into the clean, white tiles of the barbershop. The .32 caliber pistol he always carried was still tucked in his waistband, unfired. The man who had lived by the gun never had a chance to use it in his own defense. The plot had been flawlessly conceived and flawlessly executed. It was the perfect hit, a silent, brutal eulogy for a man whose entire life had been a testament to violence. The enduring fascination with Albert Anastasia stretches far beyond the cold facts of his criminal resume and into the realm of mythology, where his life has been dissected not just by historians and criminologists, but by psychologists seeking to understand the origins of such profound evil. The boy from Tropea, born into poverty and fatherless at a young age, arrived in America and found that the promises of the New World were a lie for those at the bottom of the social ladder. The American dream, for him, was not attainable through hard work and honest living, it was a prize to be seized through intimidation and violence. This foundational disillusionment warped his entire worldview. He did not see himself as a criminal, but as a pragmatist operating in a system that was itself inherently corrupt. The police, the politicians, the union officials, they were all for sale, and he simply had the courage and the ruthlessness to be the buyer. This mindset allowed him to compartmentalize his life with such chilling efficiency. The man who could order a dozen murders before lunch could then return home to New Jersey and be a doting father, because in his mind, the two worlds were not in conflict. The business of murder was just that, a business, a necessary function within the ecosystem he inhabited. His notorious temper, the source of his Mad Hatter moniker, can be seen as the pressure valve for this constant cognitive dissonance. The rage that erupted over a overcooked steak or a late subordinate was the suppressed fury of a man who had to constantly maintain a facade, the seething resentment against a world that demanded he play by a set of rules he knew to be fraudulent. His paranoia, while a legendary and ultimately justified trait, was also a form of profound self-awareness. He knew the nature of the world he had created because he was its chief architect. He understood that trust was an illusion and loyalty was a transaction, so he expected betrayal because it was the only currency he truly understood. This is what makes his assassination so deeply ironic. He was not killed by a stranger, but by the very principles he lived by, executed with a perfection he himself had mastered. The conspirators, Gambino and Genovese, did not outsmart him because they were more intelligent, they defeated him because they were more disciplined. They shared his amorality, but they possessed a strategic patience he lacked. His life, therefore, becomes a tragic case study in the limits of pure, unmediated power. He proved that you could build an empire on fear, but you could not sustain one. Fear is a corrosive agent that eventually eats away at the foundations of the very structure it supports. His subordinates did not betray him out of ambition alone, but out of a desperate desire for a less terrifying existence. In the end, Albert Anastasia was a victim of the monster he created, a monster that looked back at him from the shattered glass of the barbershop mirror. His story is not one of redemption or honor, but a stark, uncompromising lesson in the existential emptiness of a life dedicated solely to the accumulation of power through terror. He remains frozen in time, a figure of historical horror and grim caution, his name forever synonymous with the brutal truth that in the pursuit of absolute power, the first casualty is always the self, and the final victim is inevitably the king. The physical world that Albert Anastasia once dominated has undergone a profound transformation, yet the ghost of his influence still haunts the very streets he once ruled. The Brooklyn waterfront, the source of his immense power and wealth, is today almost unrecognizable. The chaotic, sprawling piers where his stevedores unloaded cargo under the constant threat of his enforcers have been largely replaced by sleek parks, high-end condominiums, and sanitized commercial spaces. The Gowanus Canal, a former dumping ground for the victims of his murder, incorporated, hit squads, has been the subject of extensive environmental cleanup efforts, a symbolic attempt to wash away the stains of its bloody past. The old haunts like Midnight Rose's candy store in Brownsville, the nerve center for hundreds of murder contracts, have long since been demolished, their locations now vacant lots or anonymous buildings, their dark history known only to local historians and true crime aficionados. The Park Sheraton Hotel, the scene of his operatic demise, underwent renovations and name changes, an attempt to distance itself from the infamy of that October morning, though the story of the Barbershop Assassination remains its most enduring claim to fame. This urban renewal represents a collective desire to move beyond the city's violent history, to pave over the grimy foundations upon which men like Anastasia built their empires. Yet, the legacy of his crimes is not so easily erased. The systemic corruption he perfected on the docks did not vanish with him, it evolved, finding new avenues in different industries and adapting to new forms of commerce. The template for organized crime that he helped codify, a corporate structure with a focus on labor racketeering, gambling, and loan sharking, persisted for decades within the Gambino family and its counterparts, proving far more resilient than the individual men who led it. Furthermore, the legal and law enforcement response that his murder helped catalyze created its own enduring institutions. The outrage over the Appalachian Summit, which his death indirectly triggered, led to the creation of permanent federal and state task forces dedicated solely to combating organized crime. The investigative techniques pioneered to understand his network, electronic surveillance, witness protection programs, the use of financial audits, became standard tools in the war against the Syndicate. In a bitter twist of fate, the man who evaded justice his entire life became one of the most significant catalysts for the system that would eventually imprison his successors. Today, the story of Albert Anastasia is not just a tale of a dead gangster, it is a permanent part of the American narrative, a dark chapter that is studied for what it reveals about immigration, poverty, power, and the corrupting influence of unchecked ambition. Walking through the gentrified streets of Red Hook or gazing at the modern skyline from a Brooklyn park, it is difficult to envision the shadowy, violent kingdom he commanded. But his ghost lingers in the institutional memory of the NYPD and the FBI, in the pages of history books, and in the collective understanding that beneath the gleaming surface of modern cities, the echoes of past sins can still, if one listens closely, be faintly heard. The world moved on from Albert Anastasia, but it was forever shaped by the terrifying and unambiguous lesson of his life and his death, that the pursuit of power through pure terror is a self-canceling prophecy, a fire that consumes its own source until nothing remains but ashes, and a cautionary tale whispered across generations. To reduce the life of Albert Anastasia to a simple chronology of crimes is to miss the profound and unsettling questions his existence forces us to confront about the very nature of evil, opportunity, and the dark underbelly of the American experience. He was not a mere monster born in a vacuum, he was a product of a specific set of circumstances, a human weapon forged in the crucible of early 20th century immigration, poverty, and systemic corruption. His story forces an uncomfortable examination of the limits of the immigrant narrative, challenging the simplistic notion that America was a uniform land of opportunity for all who arrived on its shores. For every success story, there were countless others who found the doors of legitimate advancement firmly shut, the path to prosperity blocked by prejudice, poverty, and a rigged system. Anastasia represents one violent, extreme response to this blocked path. He looked at the corrupt world around him, the bought politicians, the brutal police, the exploitative economic system, and decided not to reform it or rise above it, but to master it on its own terms. He saw the hypocrisy of a society that preached morality while practicing graft, and he weaponized that hypocrisy. In this, he was a dark reflection of American ambition, a perversion of the self-made man archetype. He possessed a terrifyingly pure form of the drive for success, utterly unburdened by morality or sentiment. His life begs the question, how much of his evil was a personal, innate flaw, and how much was a logical, if horrifying, adaptation to an environment that rewarded ruthlessness and punished weakness? This is not to absolve him of his immense guilt, but to contextualize it, to understand that such profound criminality does not emerge from a void. It is nurtured by a world that offers limited choices and then rewards the most brutal for taking what they are denied. Furthermore, his psychological profile presents a chilling case study in compartmentalization. The ability to be a loving family man and a mass murderer without apparent cognitive dissonance suggests a mind that could wall off entire sections of its own humanity. This was not the calculated duality of a politician maintaining a public and private face, this was a fundamental fracture in his perception of reality. The people he killed were not real people to him, they were obstacles, problems, or simply entries in a ledger. This dehumanization is the core mechanism of every genocide, every act of mass violence, and Anastasia perfected it on an industrial scale. He was, in a sense, the perfect bureaucratic killer, a forerunner to the faceless functionaries of totalitarian regimes who could sign death warrants and then go home to their families for dinner. His legacy, therefore, is not just a list of victims or a tale of gangland glory, but a permanent warning about the banality of evil and the human capacity for moral disengagement when power and profit become the sole objectives. The story of Albert Anastasia is ultimately the story of a failed human being, a man who had every opportunity to channel his intelligence and ferocity into something constructive, but who instead chose to become a force of pure destruction, a black hole of morality whose gravitational pull dragged countless others into the void with him. His life stands as a grim monument to the truth that without a moral compass, ambition is merely an engine for catastrophe, and power, when built on a foundation of fear, is a palace constructed on quicksand, destined to swallow its architect whole. To reduce the life of Albert Anastasia to a simple chronology of crimes is to miss the profound and unsettling questions his existence forces us to confront about the very nature of evil, opportunity, and the dark underbelly of the American experience. He was not a mere monster born in a vacuum, he was a product of a specific set of circumstances, a human weapon forged in the crucible of early 20th century immigration, poverty, and systemic corruption. His story forces an uncomfortable examination of the limits of the immigrant narrative, challenging the simplistic notion that America was a uniform land of opportunity for all who arrived on its shores. For every success story, there were countless others who found the doors of legitimate advancement firmly shut, the path to prosperity blocked by prejudice, poverty, and a rigged system. Anastasia represents one violent, extreme response to this blocked path. He looked at the corrupt world around him, the bought politicians, the brutal police, the exploitative economic system, and decided not to reform it or rise above it, but to master it on its own terms. He saw the hypocrisy of a society that preached morality while practicing graft, and he weaponized that hypocrisy. In this, he was a dark reflection of American ambition, a perversion of the self-made man archetype. He possessed a terrifyingly pure form of the drive for success, utterly unburdened by morality or sentiment. His life begs the question, how much of his evil was a personal, innate flaw, and how much was a logical, if horrifying, adaptation to an environment that rewarded ruthlessness and punished weakness? This is not to absolve him of his immense guilt, but to contextualize it, to understand that such profound criminality does not emerge from a void. It is nurtured by a world that offers limited choices and then rewards the most brutal for taking what they are denied. Furthermore, his psychological profile presents a chilling case study in compartmentalization. The ability to be a loving family man and a mass murderer without apparent cognitive dissonance suggests a mind that could wall off entire sections of its own humanity. This was not the calculated duality of a politician maintaining a public and private face, this was a fundamental fracture in his perception of reality. The people he killed were not real people to him, they were obstacles, problems, or simply entries in a ledger. This dehumanization is the core mechanism of every genocide, every act of mass violence, and Anastasia perfected it on an industrial scale. He was, in a sense, the perfect bureaucratic killer, a forerunner to the faceless functionaries of totalitarian regimes who could sign death warrants and then go home to their families for dinner. His legacy, therefore, is not just a list of victims or a tale of gangland glory, but a permanent warning about the banality of evil and the human capacity for moral disengagement when power and profit become the sole objectives. The story of Albert Anastasia is ultimately the story of a failed human being, a man who had every opportunity to channel his intelligence and ferocity into something constructive, but who instead chose to become a force of pure destruction, a black hole of morality whose gravitational pull dragged countless others into the void with him. His life stands as a grim monument to the truth that without a moral compass, ambition is merely an engine for catastrophe, and power, when built on a foundation of fear, is a palace constructed on quicksand, destined to swallow its architect whole. The final, enduring image of Albert Anastasia, lying dead on a barbershop floor amidst shattered glass and pooling blood, is more than just the conclusion of a single violent life. It serves as a powerful and resonant closing argument on the entire era he embodied. That scene, captured in grainy black and white photographs, has been seared into the collective consciousness, becoming an indelible symbol of the inevitable fate awaiting those who live by the sword. Yet, to view his death as a simple case of poetic justice is to overlook its deeper significance as a calculated political act that marked a definitive turning point in the evolution of organized crime. The barbershop was not chosen at random, it was selected for its symbolic value. It was a place of grooming, of presenting a respectable face to the world, a ritual Anastasia engaged in to maintain his facade of a legitimate businessman. By murdering him there, his executioners were not just killing a man, they were violently stripping away that facade, exposing the brutal reality that lay beneath the tailored suits and the suburban domesticity. They were demonstrating that there was no sanctuary, no realm of civilized life that was immune to the consequences of his actions. The shattered mirror, a piece of cinematic symbolism almost too perfect to be real, reflected the brokenness of his power and the fragmentation of his criminal empire, which was already being reassembled under new management before his body was even cold. In the days and weeks that followed, as Carlo Gambino consolidated his power with quiet efficiency, the underworld underwent a fundamental shift. The era of the loud, flamboyant, and publicly terrifying boss was over. The new model, epitomized by Gambino, was one of near invisibility, of power exercised through whispers and financial leverage rather than through public displays of violence. The Mad Hatter was dead, and the age of the Silent Dawn had begun. This transition was not merely a change in management style, it was a necessary adaptation for survival in a world that was increasingly intolerant of the kind of open criminality Anastasia represented. His death was, in a very real sense, a sacrifice made by the Syndicate to appease the gods of public opinion and law enforcement, a bloody offering meant to ensure the continued prosperity of the whole. And for a time, it worked. The Gambino family entered its golden age, becoming more powerful and wealthy than ever before, its operations more deeply embedded in the legitimate economy. But the seeds of its eventual downfall, sown by the government's reaction to the Anastasia murder and the Apalachian fiasco, would eventually sprout. The story of Albert Anastasia, therefore, does not have a neat ending. It spirals outwards, its consequences echoing through the decades. It is a story that continues to be written in the ongoing battle between organized crime and the forces of law and order, a battle whose tactics and players were forever changed by the life and death of one uniquely violent and ambitious man. His grave may be a quiet, unassuming plot, but his legacy is a loud and chaotic symphony of violence, power, and betrayal that continues to resonate, a dark and permanent chord in the complex song of American history. And so, the echo of that final, violent chord in the barbershop fades, leaving behind a silence filled with reflection and a multitude of unanswered questions about the nature of power, legacy, and the indelible marks one man can leave on history. The physical entity of Albert Anastasia, the son of Tropia, the Lord of the Docks, the Master of Murder, Incorporated, was gone, but the conceptual shockwaves of his existence continue to ripple through time, influencing not only the structure of organized crime but also our very understanding of criminal psychology and the limits of human ambition. In the years following his death, as the Gambino family solidified its empire and the American Mafia reached its zenith of power and influence in the 1960s and 70s, the ghost of Anastasia served as a dark totem, a reminder of the raw, untamed forces that simmered just beneath the surface of their corporate facade. He was the benchmark for ruthlessness, a name invoked to measure the mettle of other aspiring gangsters, yet simultaneously a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess. His life became a foundational text in the underworld's own oral history, a chapter on what to emulate in terms of sheer will and what to avoid in terms of strategic folly. For law enforcement, his case remained an open wound and a perpetual lesson. The failure to convict him twice, followed by the spectacular failure to solve his murder, was a humbling experience that forced a complete overhaul of investigative techniques. The realization that the mob could reach a protected witness in police custody led to the creation of more sophisticated, more secure witness protection programs. The intricate web of his criminal enterprises, which intertwined legitimate unions, businesses, and political corruption, demonstrated the necessity of financial investigations and the follow-the-money approach that would later become a cornerstone of the RICO statutes. On a broader cultural scale, the archetype of the psychotic, volatile gangster that Anastasia embodied has become a staple of cinema and literature, yet these fictional portrayals often sanitize the true, grinding terror of his reality. The real Albert Anastasia was not a character, he was a catastrophic event in the lives of hundreds, a human hurricane of violence and fear. His story forces us to look beyond the romanticized veneer of the gangster and confront the bleak, unglamorous truth of a life dedicated to predation. It challenges us to consider the societal failures that create such monsters, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the corrosive influence of systemic corruption, without ever excusing the monstrous acts themselves. The journey of Umberto Anastasia from a small Italian village to a bloody end in a New York hotel is, in its essence, a tragic American story, a dark refraction of the immigrant dream that highlights the perilous gap between ambition and morality. His legacy is not a single thing, but a complex tapestry woven with threads of terror, innovation, failure, and a grim, undeniable historical significance. He was a man who sought to carve his name into the world with a knife, and though time has weathered the stone, the deep, ugly scar remains, a permanent testament to a life of immense power and profound emptiness, a chilling reminder that the most formidable empires built on fear are always, inevitably, destined to collapse under the weight of their own inherent contradiction. In the absolute final analysis, when every murder has been tallied, every betrayal recounted, and every moment of his terrifying reign has been dissected, the figure of Albert Anastasia remains an unsettling and permanent fissure in the bedrock of American history, a dark well that reflects not a single, simple monster, but the complex and often horrifying potential within the human condition itself. He was a man who embodied a terrifying paradox. He was both a creator and a destroyer on a monumental scale. He helped create the modern, corporate structure of the American Mafia, an entity that would endure for decades, yet his personal methodology was one of such pure, unvarnished destruction that it ultimately necessitated his own annihilation. He built an empire of immense wealth and power, yet he left behind a legacy defined by emptiness and ash. He commanded absolute fear, yet he died in a state of vulnerability and surprise, a testament to the ultimate futility of a life lived in a state of perpetual war. His story transcends the narrow confines of true crime and becomes a Shakespearean tragedy of ambition, a cautionary tale written not in ink, but in blood. It is a story about the seductive nature of power and its corrosive effect on the soul. It is a story about the failure of institutions, of government, of law, of community, to protect the vulnerable and curb the predatory. And most profoundly, it is a story about the American dream itself, and its dark, twisted doppelganger that flourished in the shadows of the very cities that promised opportunity. Anastasia did not believe in the dream of honest labor and gradual prosperity. He believed in the nightmare of immediate, total domination seized by force. His life forces us to acknowledge that this dark counterpart exists, that for some, the path to a form of perverted success is paved not with gold, but with the suffering of others. There is no redemption in his narrative, no moment of clarity or remorse, only the relentless, forward momentum of a man consumed by his own inner demons, a fire that burned until there was nothing left to consume but itself. The silence that followed his death was not just the end of a life, it was the silence of a lesson learned too late, the quiet that follows a storm that has laid waste to everything in its path. The world, of course, moved on. New bosses rose, new crimes were committed, new laws were written. But the shadow of the Mad Hatter, the Lord of the Docks, the Master of Murder, Incorporated, lingers. He is a permanent part of the landscape, a grim reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink when conscience is abandoned and power is pursued as an end in itself. His name, Albert Anastasia, is no longer just that of a man, it is a symbol, a historical marker for a certain kind of terrifying, absolute, and self-devouring power. And as long as we seek to understand the darker chapters of our past, as long as we strive to comprehend the complex forces that shape both heroes and villains, his story will continue to be told, not to glorify, but to warn, to educate, and to remind us that the line between ambition and damnation is often perilously thin, and that the price of crossing it is everything.